It was a warm spring afternoon, and Sarah had just finished her shift at the local cafe. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the small town of Green Hollow, a quiet place where nothing much ever seemed to happen. Sarah's life, like the town, was predictable, routine even. She lived with her mother, Lisa, a woman who had always been private but loving. As she walked home, her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. At first, Sarah thought to ignore it, but something deep inside urged her to pick up. "Hello," she answered hesitantly, pressing the phone to her ear. The voice on the other end was frantic, barely coherent. "Is this Sarah? You need to come to Green Hollow Hospital right away. Your mother's been in an accident." Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. An accident? What happened? Is she okay? "Please just get here. There's something else, something urgent." The line went dead. Without wasting a second, Sarah rushed to her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios as she sped through the narrow streets of Green Hollow, her heart pounding in her chest. The hospital was only a few minutes away, but every second felt like an eternity. When she finally arrived, she sprinted through the sliding doors, desperate for answers. At the front desk, the receptionist immediately recognized her. "Sarah, right? Your mother's in the emergency room. Follow me." The receptionist led her down a long, sterile hallway, the smell of disinfectant thick in the air. Sarah's stomach churned. She tried to stay calm, but something felt off. Why hadn't they told her more over the phone? What was the urgent news? As they reached the emergency room doors, 2 police officers were waiting. Sarah froze. Why were the police here? Her mother wasn't a criminal. She was just an ordinary woman, working at the local library, living a quiet life. Nothing about this made sense. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward. "Miss Thompson, I'm Officer Harding. There's something you need to know before you see your mother." Sarah's voice was shaky. "What is it? What's going on?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, and Sarah could sense the hesitation in the air. "Your mother was in a car accident with a man named Jack Davidson," Harding began slowly. "Davidson is a wanted criminal. He escaped from a federal prison 2 weeks ago, and your mother was in the car with him when it crashed." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her mother, in a car with a criminal, an escaped convict. She shook her head, trying to make sense of it. "There has to be some mistake. My mom doesn't know anyone like that. She's just a librarian. She doesn't even speed." Officer Harding's face softened, but his tone remained firm. "We thought so too, but Davidson claims he knows your mother. Intimately." The room seemed to spin around Sarah. Her legs felt weak, and she gripped the edge of the chair for support. "What do you mean he knows her? How?" "We're not sure of all the details yet," the officer continued. "But Davidson has been insisting that your mother was a part of his life a long time ago, before she moved to Green Hollow." Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be true. Her mother had always been open with her, hadn't she? There had never been any signs of a secret life, no mysterious phone calls, no strange men lurking around. How could she have been involved with a man like Jack Davidson? "Can I see her?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The officers nodded, stepping aside to let her into the room. The heavy doors swung open, and Sarah's eyes immediately landed on her mother. Lisa lay in the hospital bed, her face pale and bruised, a cut above her eyebrow, and an oxygen mask over her mouth. She looked fragile, nothing like the strong woman Sarah had known all her life. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she approached the bed. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What's going on?" Lisa stirred, her eyes slowly fluttering open. When she saw Sarah, a flicker of recognition passed over her face, but it was clouded with pain and something else. Guilt. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," Lisa croaked, her voice weak and strained. Sarah's heart ached at the sight of her mother like this, But she needed answers. Why was that man in the car with you? Who is he? Lisa closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Sarah feared she might not respond at all. But then, in a hoarse whisper, Lisa spoke words that shattered Sarah's world. Jack. Jack is your father. The room fell into a deafening silence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The walls seemed to close in on her, and she stumbled backward, struggling to process what her mother had just said. Her father, the man she had been told was long gone, dead before she was born. This criminal, this escaped convict, was her father. No, that's impossible, Sarah stammered, shaking her head. You said my father died in a car crash when I was a baby. You said. I lied, Lisa interrupted, her voice cracking with regret. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if you never knew the truth, you'd have a better life. The weight of her mother's words pressed down on Sarah like 1,000 pounds. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything she had believed about her life, her family, had been a lie. But why? Why would you lie to me about something like this? Sarah's voice was filled with both anger and confusion. Lisa's eyes, red and weary, locked onto her daughter's. Because Jack was dangerous. I had to get away from him. I had to protect you. He wasn't always a criminal, but after you were born, things changed. He got involved with the wrong people. I couldn't let him ruin your life too. Sarah's mind was reeling. Her father, a man she had never known, a man she had never even thought to question, was a criminal, an escaped convict, and now her mother was caught up in his world again. Just then, the door to the room opened, and Officer Harding stepped inside. Miss Thompson, I hate to interrupt, but we need to take your mother into custody for questioning. There's more going on here than just the accident. Sarah spun around, her face flushed with shock. What do you mean? She's the victim here. Harding hesitated before replying, his tone grave. It's not that simple. We've uncovered evidence that suggests your mother may have been helping Jack evade capture. We need to understand her role in all of this. Sarah felt the ground slipping from beneath her feet. Nothing made sense anymore. The woman who had raised her, who had always been her rock, was now at the center of a tangled web of lies, crime, and betrayal. As Lisa was wheeled away in handcuffs, Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the room, her world shattered. This was just the beginning. The hidden truth about her mother and her father was about to come out, and Sarah knew her life would never be the same. Sarah sat alone in her childhood home, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. The house felt different now, like a stranger's place. Every room held memories of a life she thought she knew, but now those memories were tainted with doubt, like cracks in a once perfect picture. She looked at the family photos on the wall, staring at the smiling faces of her mother and herself. No sign of a father, no sign of the man who had crashed into her life like an unexpected storm. How had she missed it? How had she lived in this house for so long, oblivious to the secrets it harbored? The town of Green Hollow had always been quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least that's what Sarah had believed. Growing up here had been uneventful, predictable even. It was a town frozen in time, where nothing changed, and that was part of its charm. Sarah's life, much like the town, had followed a steady, predictable path. She worked at the cafe, helped her mother at the library, and spent her evenings with friends she had known since childhood. There had been no drama, no chaos, just the steady, rhythmic beat of small-town life. Lisa Thompson, Sarah's mother, had been a fixture in the town for as long as anyone could remember. The quiet, hard-working librarian was known for her kindness and her devotion to her only daughter. She was the kind of woman people admired from a distance, someone who didn't engage in gossip or drama. If anything, Lisa had always seemed slightly aloof, as if she was holding part of herself back from the world. But no one questioned it. Everyone had their quirks, and Lisa's privacy had always been respected. But now, as Sarah sat there in the dim light of the living room, she wondered if anyone else had noticed something strange about her mother. Were there signs that she had missed? Was there anyone who had known the truth all along? The idea that her mother had been hiding something so monumental, that she had been involved with a criminal, that Jack Davidson was her father, was too much to comprehend. Sarah felt betrayed, like her entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking her train of thought. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her best friend. "Emma, I heard what happened. Are you okay? Call me if you need anything." Sarah couldn't bring herself to respond. How could she explain any of this to Emma? How could she tell her that her mother, the woman who had raised her, the woman everyone in town respected, wasn't who she claimed to be? The weight of it all pressed down on Sarah's chest, making it hard to breathe. She needed answers, but the only person who could give them to her was in police custody. In the days that followed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the town was watching her. People whispered when she walked by, their eyes full of curiosity and judgment. The news of Lisa's accident and her connection to Jack Davidson had spread like wildfire. Small towns had a way of magnifying every rumor, every scandal, and this was the biggest scandal Green Hollow had seen in years. Sarah found herself avoiding the usual places she frequented: the cafe where she worked, the grocery store, even the library where her mother had spent so many years. None of them felt safe anymore. Everywhere she went, she could feel the eyes on her, hear the whispers that followed her like a shadow. One afternoon, desperate for some sort of clarity, Sarah decided to visit the town's historical archives. The library was closed due to her mother's absence, but Sarah had a spare key. Her mother had given it to her years ago, trusting her with access to the place she had spent most of her life. Walking through the darkened halls of the library, Sarah felt a pang of sorrow. This place had been her mother's sanctuary. Lisa had poured her heart and soul into maintaining the library, and now it felt like a tomb of forgotten stories. In the back corner of the library, hidden from the public, was the town's archive section. Old newspapers, journals, and letters were stored there, documenting decades of Green Hollow's history. Sarah pulled out a stack of newspapers from the year she was born and began scanning through them, searching for any mention of Jack Davidson or her mother. At first, the articles seemed mundane, typical reports of local events, births, weddings, and small-town gossip. But then she found it. The headline was small, tucked away on the third page of the Green Hollow Gazette: "Local woman and infant daughter escape criminal's grasp." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the article. It was a brief piece, barely more than a few paragraphs, but it confirmed what her mother had told her. The article detailed how a young woman, identified only as Lisa, had fled from a man named Jack Davidson, a known associate of a criminal gang that had been operating in the nearby city. According to the article, Lisa had taken her infant daughter and disappeared shortly after providing information that led to Davidson's arrest. It was this testimony that had put Jack behind bars. Sarah stared at the words, trying to process what she was reading. Her mother had been involved with a criminal gang. Her mother had testified against Jack Davidson, the man who was now her father. But why? Why had her mother been involved with him in the first place? And why had she kept all of this a secret for so many years? Sarah's mind raced with questions. Had her mother been a willing participant in the gang's activities, or had she been coerced? Had she loved Jack, or had she feared him? The article provided no answers, only more confusion. She needed to know more, but there was no one left to ask. Her mother was in custody, and Jack Davidson was still recovering from the accident. As she sat there in the darkened library, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to her childhood. There had been moments, fleeting, almost forgettable moments, that now seemed to hold new meaning. The time her mother had forbidden her from going to the nearby city. The way Lisa had always kept a close eye on Sarah whenever they were out in public, her eyes scanning the crowd as if she was looking for someone or something. The nights when her mother would sit by the window, staring out into the darkness long after Sarah had gone to bed. At the time, Sarah had thought nothing of it. But now, those moments took on a new significance. Her mother had been hiding from something, or someone, all along. A creaking sound startled Sarah out of her thoughts. She turned around, her heart pounding, and saw a figure standing in the doorway of the library. It was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who ran the post office. Sarah relaxed slightly, but the tension in the air remained. "I didn't mean to startle you, dear," Mrs. Henderson said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years. "I just saw the light on and thought I'd check in." Sarah nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She had always liked Mrs. Henderson. She was kind, always ready with a smile or a comforting word. But now, Sarah felt wary of everyone. Who else in this town knew her mother's secret? "I know what you're going through, Sarah," Mrs. Henderson said, taking a step closer. "This town can be cruel when it wants to be. People like to gossip, especially when they think they know the whole story." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean? Do you know something about my mother?" Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her wrinkled hands clasped in front of her. "Your mother, she's always been a good woman. But this town, people talk. There were rumors, back when you were little. Whispers about her past, about the company she used to keep. But most of us didn't believe it. She was always so private, so careful. We just assumed she was trying to protect you." Sarah's heart sank. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? Mrs. Henderson gave her a sad smile. "We all have our secrets, dear. Some are just harder to keep than others." Sarah felt a wave of frustration and sadness wash over her. Her whole life had been a lie, and now it seemed like the entire town had been in on the secret. How could her mother have kept this from her? How could she have lived her life pretending to be someone she wasn't? As Mrs. Henderson turned to leave, she paused in the doorway. "Your mother may have made mistakes, Sarah, but she loves you. Everything she did was for you." Sarah didn't respond. She wasn't sure she believed that anymore. As the door closed behind Mrs. Henderson, Sarah sat back down at the table, staring at the article in front of her. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She had come here looking for answers, but all she had found were more questions. The hidden truth about her mother's past was slowly unraveling, and Sarah was beginning to realize that she might never fully understand the choices her mother had made. But one thing was clear: the woman she had known as her mother was gone, and in her place was a stranger, a woman with a past far darker and more complicated than Sarah had ever imagined. The days that followed were a blur for Sarah. She was trapped in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: betrayal, confusion, anger, and an overwhelming sense of grief for the life she thought she had. Her mother remained in custody, under police investigation for aiding Jack Davidson's escape, though Lisa hadn't uttered a word to confirm or deny the allegations. The silence gnawed at Sarah. Every time she tried to visit her mother, the authorities denied her, citing the ongoing investigation. It was as if a wall had been erected between them, and Sarah felt herself growing more isolated by the day. The town's reaction was worse than she'd feared. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. It was outright avoidance. People she'd known her whole life crossed the street to avoid her. When she walked into a store, conversations would halt abruptly, and eyes would dart away as if they were afraid that just being near her would taint them with her family's disgrace. Even Emma, her best friend, hadn't called back after Sarah left a rambling message trying to explain her mother's connection to the criminal. The isolation was suffocating. Sarah spent most of her time in the house, unwilling to face the world outside. She dug through old photographs, searching for any clues in her mother's past, but found nothing unusual. It was as if Lisa had been methodical, erasing any trace of the life she'd led before Green Hollow. Everything that had seemed so simple, so ordinary, was now shrouded in suspicion. Sarah could barely look at old birthday photos without wondering if the smile on her mother's face had been masking a world of secrets. How could she have lived in this house for so long and known nothing? Frustration building, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't sit here in this house forever, wallowing in confusion. If her mother wouldn't give her the answers, she would have to find them herself. There was only one person who could shed light on this dark chapter of her mother's life: Jack Davidson. Jack was still at Green Hollow General Hospital, recovering from the accident. His injuries were severe enough that he was under police guard, but he hadn't been transferred to prison yet. The thought of confronting him terrified Sarah, but she needed to know the truth. She needed to know who this man was, who her father was, and why her mother had lied for so long. The next morning, she steeled herself and headed to the hospital. As she approached the entrance, her nerves threatened to get the better of her, but she pushed through. She couldn't turn back now. She'd made up her mind. Inside, the sterile scent of disinfectant hit her, reminding her of her last visit when she had seen her mother in the emergency room. But this time, her purpose was different. She was here for answers. Sarah approached the front desk, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm here to see Jack Davidson," she said, her voice firm despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. The nurse at the desk gave her a strange look, but Sarah had anticipated that. The town was small, and news traveled fast. "He's under police custody," the nurse said hesitantly. "Only law enforcement or legal representatives are allowed." Sarah leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I'm his daughter." The nurse's eyes widened slightly in recognition, then softened with what seemed like pity. She sighed and gave Sarah a sympathetic nod. "I'll let the officers know you're here." After a few tense minutes, a police officer escorted Sarah to Jack's room. Her hands were trembling, but she clenched them into fists to steady herself. The officer opened the door, and there he was, Jack Davidson, her father, the man who had turned her life upside down without ever being a part of it. Jack lay in the hospital bed, his face pale and bruised, his leg in a cast, with multiple IVs attached to his arm. His eyes were closed, but as Sarah stepped into the room, he stirred, opening his eyes slowly. When his gaze met hers, there was a flicker of recognition that sent a chill down her spine. "So, you're Sarah," he rasped, his voice weak but steady. "I knew you'd come." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and approached the foot of the bed, keeping her distance. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to stay calm. "Why now?" Jack's eyes darkened, and he shifted slightly, wincing at the pain in his side. "I didn't have much of a choice. After your mother betrayed the gang, I went down. I've been rotting in that prison for years because of her, but I escaped for a reason. To get revenge on her." Sarah's voice was sharper now, the anger rising. "Is that what this is all about? Did you want to hurt her after all this time?" Jack shook his head, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. "Revenge? No, you've got it all wrong, kid. I wasn't coming to hurt your mother. I was coming to protect her." Sarah blinked, confused. "Protect her? From what?" Jack's expression darkened even further. "From the people who want her dead. The gang never forgot what she did. They'd been watching, waiting for the right moment. I knew they'd eventually come after her, and when I heard the rumors that they'd found her, I knew I had to act." Sarah's heart raced. "What are you talking about? You're a criminal. How could you possibly protect her?" Jack's eyes bore into hers, and for a moment, Sarah felt like she was seeing a ghost from her mother's past, a shadow of a life she'd never known. "Your mother was in deep, Sarah. We were both in deep, but she wasn't a bad person. She did what she had to do to get out and protect you. She loved you more than anything, and that's why she did it. That's why she betrayed us." Sarah felt her stomach twist. "Betrayed you? You mean she turned you in?" Jack nodded slowly. "She thought it was the only way to escape. She gave the feds everything they needed to take us down. And for years I sat in that cell, thinking about how she'd lied to me, lied to everyone. But then I realized she was just trying to save you." Sarah's mind was spinning. This was too much. Her mother had been part of a criminal gang, had betrayed them to save herself and her daughter, And now the ghosts of that past were coming back to haunt them. How had she never known? How had her mother kept this secret for so long? Why didn't she ever tell me? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack sighed, his eyes softening. She didn't want you to be tainted by the past. She wanted you to have a normal life, away from all of this. But now they're coming for her. And if they can't get to her, they'll come for you. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. What do you mean? Are they after me now? Jack nodded grimly. They're not the kind of people who let things go. They want revenge for what she did. They've been watching, waiting for the right moment. And now that I'm out, they'll think I'm trying to make a move. You and your mother are both in danger. Sarah felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. Everything she had known, everything she had believed about her quiet, simple life, was unraveling before her eyes. She was part of something much bigger, much darker, than she could have ever imagined. And now she was in the crosshairs of a criminal syndicate she hadn't even known existed. What do I do? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. How do I protect her? How do I protect myself? Jack looked at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. You need to find out what she knows. There's more to this than you realize. Your mother, she's been hiding more than just me. There's something else, something they want. And if you don't figure it out, they'll come for you both. Sarah's mind raced. What more could her mother be hiding? What else was there to this twisted, tangled web of secrets and lies? She had come here for answers, but all she had found were more questions, questions that only her mother could answer. But with Lisa still under police custody, there was no way to confront her now. Jack's voice softened. I know you don't trust me, and I don't blame you. But right now, I'm the only one who can help you. If you want to save your mother, you'll have to trust me. Sarah stared at him, torn between disbelief and desperation. Could she trust this man, her father, a criminal, someone her mother had spent her life running from? Did she even have a choice? As she stood there, staring at the man who had shattered her world, one thing became clear. The truth was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And if she wanted to survive, she would have to dig deeper into the past, no matter how dark it was. Sarah left the hospital feeling like she was walking through a fog. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of Green Hollow, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too tangled with the web of secrets that had just been laid before her. Jack Davidson, her father, claimed that her mother had betrayed a criminal gang to save her. And now, decades later, they were back, seeking revenge. It was all too surreal. Her life had never been more than the sum of ordinary days in an ordinary town. But now, everything was unraveling, and the danger felt very real. She drove home in silence, her thoughts whirling. If what Jack had said was true, her mother was in far greater danger than Sarah had imagined. The gang wasn't just after her. They were after something her mother had kept hidden all these years. But what? What could her mother possibly have that was worth risking their lives for? When Sarah arrived back at the house, it felt emptier than ever. The air was thick with the weight of the secrets that now lingered in every corner. She made her way to her mother's bedroom, standing in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. It had always been a simple room, nothing fancy, just practical. But now Sarah saw it in a different light. This room had been her mother's sanctuary, a place where she had likely hidden the pieces of her past that she didn't want anyone to find. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah began searching through her mother's things. She sifted through old clothes, jewelry, and boxes of keepsakes from her childhood. It felt invasive, almost like a betrayal, but Sarah needed answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. As she rummaged through her mother's nightstand, Sarah's fingers brushed against something hard and metallic hidden behind a stack of old papers. She pulled it out, a small rusted key. It didn't belong to anything she recognized in the house, but the sight of it made her pulse quicken. Something told her this key was important. It had the weight of a secret long kept. Her mind raced, trying to remember if there was anything in the house that required a key. And then it hit her, the old trunk in the attic. It had always been locked, and her mother had never let her near it, dismissing it as old family junk that wasn't worth bothering with. But now Sarah knew better. If her mother had kept that trunk locked for all these years, there had to be something inside that mattered. She hurried up the creaky wooden stairs to the attic, her heart pounding in her chest. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with boxes of forgotten memories. In the far corner sat the trunk, a heavy, battered relic from her mother's past. Sarah knelt in front of it, her hands trembling as she inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a rusty creak, and the lid popped open. Inside, Sarah found stacks of old documents, yellowed with age. There were birth certificates, financial records, and legal papers, but none of it made sense at first glance. She dug deeper, pushing aside envelopes and faded letters, until she uncovered something far more significant. An old notebook, bound in cracked leather. The pages were filled with her mother's handwriting, but these weren't diary entries. They were notes, detailed records of meetings, locations, and names. Some of the names were familiar, like Jack Davidson, but many were strangers. As Sarah flipped through the notebook, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. This was no ordinary journal. It was a log of her mother's involvement with the criminal gang, a record of every deal, every betrayal, and every move she had made to escape them. There were pages upon pages of coded messages, maps, and references to hidden cash and documents. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what this meant. Her mother hadn't just been a passive participant in the gang's activities. She had been actively working against them from the inside, collecting information, planning her escape. And now, that information was still out there, unfinished business that the gang wanted to settle. One entry, in particular, stood out. It was dated just days before Sarah was born, and it detailed a deal that had gone wrong. Something about a large sum of money that had been laundered through a series of businesses. The money had vanished after Lisa's betrayal, and it seemed the gang believed she still had it, or at least knew where it was. That's what they wanted. They didn't just want revenge. They wanted the money her mother had stolen. Sarah's blood ran cold. This was what Jack had been trying to warn her about. The gang wasn't just after her mother for revenge. They were hunting her down to reclaim a fortune that had been hidden for decades. And if her mother didn't give it up, they wouldn't stop until they destroyed everything in their path. The sound of a door slamming downstairs jolted Sarah out of her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anyone, and the house had been dead silent when she arrived. She quickly shoved the notebook back into the trunk and closed the lid, her mind racing. Was it the police? Or worse, the gang? She crept down the stairs, her pulse pounding in her ears. When she reached the bottom of the staircase, she froze. Standing in the doorway was a man she didn't recognize. Tall, lean, with a sharp, predatory gaze. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Sarah with a smirk that sent chills down her spine. Well, he said, his voice slick and dangerous. Looks like I found the daughter. I was hoping to run into you. Sarah's throat went dry. She didn't need to ask who he was. Everything about him screamed trouble. He had the look of someone who had spent his life in the shadows, someone who thrived on other people's fear. What do you want? Sarah asked, her voice shaking despite her efforts to stay calm. The man stepped closer, his smile widening. I'm here for what your mother took. You see, your mom thought she could walk away from this. She thought she could hide from us. But there are no loose ends in this business. And now, it's your turn to pay up. Sarah's mind raced. She needed to think fast. The notebook upstairs held the key to everything. But she couldn't let this man know that she had found it. She had to stall, buy herself time to figure out her next move. I don't know what you're talking about, she lied, keeping her voice as steady as possible. My mother never told me anything. The man's smile faltered for a moment, but he didn't seem convinced. That's cute. Really, it is. But I think you're smarter than that. And I think you know exactly what your mother was hiding." He took another step toward her, and Sarah felt her heart hammering in her chest. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't let him see her fear. She had to keep him talking. "If you hurt me, you'll never find out what you're looking for," Sarah said, trying to sound bolder than she felt. The man raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Is that so?" Sarah nodded. "I don't know where it is, but I can help you find it. Just don't hurt my mom." For a moment, the man seemed to consider her offer, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. "You think you can play me?" He sneered. "Nice try, kid. But we've been at this a lot longer than you. Your mother's been running from us for years. And now you're going to finish what she started." Before Sarah could react, the man lunged toward her, grabbing her by the arm. Panic surged through her, but she fought to stay calm. She needed a plan. She needed a way out. And fast. But just as she was about to struggle, the sound of sirens pierced the air outside, growing louder by the second. The man cursed under his breath, his grip tightening for a moment before he shoved her away. "Looks like you've bought yourself some time," he growled. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." With one last menacing glance, the man slipped out the back door, disappearing into the night just as the police cars pulled up in front of the house. Sarah stood there, shaking, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The notebook, the money, the man who had come for her. It was all too much. But one thing was clear. The danger was far from over. And if she wanted to save her mother and herself, Sarah would have to uncover every last secret her mother had buried, no matter what it cost. The sound of footsteps approaching snapped her out of her daze. The police were here, but they couldn't protect her from what was coming. The truth was still out there, hidden in the shadows of her mother's past. And Sarah knew that if she didn't find it soon, it would consume them both. The police swarmed the house within moments, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows through the windows. Sarah stood frozen as two officers approached her, one speaking into his radio while the other assessed the situation. She felt numb, her mind spinning from the confrontation with the man who had just threatened her life. Everything was happening so fast, and yet at the same time, it felt as if the world had slowed down around her. The gravity of the situation weighed heavy on her chest, and she struggled to keep her composure. "Miss Thompson," one of the officers asked, snapping Sarah back to the present. His voice was calm but firm, the practiced tone of someone who had seen this kind of chaos before. "We received a call about an intruder. Are you all right?" Sarah nodded, still trying to process everything. "There was a man. He was here. He said he was looking for something my mother took. I don't know what he was talking about, but—" She paused, her words tumbling out too fast. "He said the gang my mother was involved with is coming after us. He just left when he heard the sirens." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before turning back to Sarah. "We need you to come with us to the station to give a full statement. But first, we'll need to secure the house and make sure no one else is here." Sarah nodded, her hands shaking. She watched as the officers moved methodically through the house, checking every room, every corner. The whole place felt different now. Cold, threatening, like a stranger had invaded not just her home, but her entire life. She had never imagined that something like this could happen in Green Hollow, a place where nothing ever seemed to change, where everyone's biggest worry was the weather or the local sports team. But now, it was as if the town had been swallowed up by the secrets her mother had kept hidden for so long. After what felt like an eternity, the officers confirmed that the house was clear. They escorted Sarah to their car, and as she sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the flashing lights reflecting off the neighboring houses, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had become unrecognizable. Every familiar landmark, every quiet street seemed tinged with danger now. It was as though the peace she had once taken for granted had been shattered, and she wasn't sure if it would ever return. At the police station, Sarah was led to a small interview room, where another officer, Detective Miller, greeted her. He was older, with a weathered face and tired eyes that suggested he had seen too much in his career. He offered her a seat and a cup of water before sitting down across from her. "We know you've been through a lot in the last few days," Miller began, his tone gentle but professional. "But we need to ask you some questions to get a clearer picture of what's happening. You said a man broke into your house tonight. Can you describe him?" Sarah took a deep breath, recalling the intruder's sharp features and menacing demeanor. She described him in as much detail as she could, her voice steadying as she recounted the encounter. "He said my mother took something from the gang she was involved with. He mentioned money. He seemed convinced that I knew where it was." Miller leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "This gang, did your mother ever tell you anything about them?" "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "I didn't even know she was involved in anything like this until a few days ago. I found out about Jack Davidson, my father. He's the one who told me about the gang." At the mention of Jack Davidson's name, Miller's expression hardened. "Davidson's a dangerous man. I've been tracking his gang for years, and we were lucky to get him behind bars. But now that he's out, everything is up in the air again." Sarah's stomach twisted with unease. "Jack said he wasn't here to hurt my mother. He claimed he was trying to protect her from the gang. He said they're after her because of something she did years ago. Something about a large sum of money that disappeared after she testified against them." Miller nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It makes sense. From what we know, your mother was involved with Davidson's crew for a while before she turned informant. Her testimony helped put some of them away, but not all. The ones who are still out there have a long memory, and if they think she's hiding money from them, they'll stop at nothing to get it back." A heavy silence settled over the room as Sarah absorbed the weight of the detective's words. She thought back to the notebook she had found in the attic, filled with cryptic notes and records of her mother's past dealings. The pieces were starting to come together, but there were still so many unanswered questions, so many layers to the story that Sarah hadn't uncovered yet. "What about the notebook I found?" she asked, her voice tentative. "It's in the attic, hidden in an old trunk. It has notes, details about the gang, their meetings, everything. Could that help?" Miller's eyes lit up with interest. "If there's detailed information in there, it could be crucial. We need to get that notebook, and fast. It might contain the evidence we need to finally take this gang down for good." Sarah nodded, her heart racing. She had been holding onto the notebook like a lifeline, but now it seemed even more important than she had realized. If it held the key to ending this nightmare, she was willing to do whatever it took to protect her mother and herself. After leaving her statement with the police, Sarah was allowed to go home, but the officers made it clear they would be increasing patrols around her house. The feeling of unease followed her like a shadow as she drove back to the empty house. It felt like she was living in a different world now, one where danger lurked around every corner, where secrets could destroy lives, and where trust was as fragile as glass. The moment she stepped through the door, she went straight to the attic. The trunk sat there, just as she had left it, and she opened it to retrieve the notebook. Her hand shook as she flipped through the pages again, her mind racing with the new information Detective Miller had shared. This wasn't just about her mother's past anymore. It was about survival. Her mother's life, and possibly her own, depended on the information in these pages. As she sat in the attic, surrounded by dust and forgotten memories, Sarah couldn't help but think about how far she had come in just a few short days. She had gone from being an ordinary woman in an ordinary town to being the key player in a dangerous game, one that her mother had been trying to shield her from for years. But now the truth was out, and there was no going back. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "We know you have the notebook. You're running out of time." Sarah's heart stopped. Her hands trembled as she stared at the message, the ominous words glaring back at her like a death sentence. They knew. The gang had found out about the notebook. She wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. In that moment, Sarah realized she was truly on her own. The police could offer some protection, but they couldn't stop the relentless pursuit of a gang hell-bent on revenge. And now, with the notebook in her possession, she had become their prime target. Her mind raced as she considered her next move. She could run, but where would she go? The gang had eyes everywhere, and they would never stop hunting her down. The only way out was to finish what her mother had started all those years ago, to find the missing money and bring down the people who had torn her life apart. With the notebook clutched tightly in her hands, Sarah stood up, determination hardening her resolve. She wasn't just going to survive this. She was going to end it, once and for all. But first, she needed to find the missing piece of the puzzle, the key to unlocking her mother's final secret. Only then could she face the danger head-on and uncover the truth that had been buried for so long. Because now, it wasn't just about protecting herself. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming her life from the shadows of the past. And this time, Sarah wasn't going to let fear hold her back. As she headed downstairs, she made a silent vow to herself. No matter what it took, no matter how dangerous it got, she would find the answers. She would fight for her mother, for her own life, and for the truth that had been hidden for too long. The final battle was coming, and Sarah knew she had to be ready. Because this time, it was personal. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. The weight of everything, the notebook, the mysterious text, the man who had threatened her, kept her mind on edge, her heart racing with an urgency that wouldn't let her rest. She knew that time was running out. The gang was closing in, and she had to act before they made their next move. There was no one left to turn to. She was on her own now. Her only ally, Jack Davidson, her father, was still in the hospital, and even if she could trust him, he couldn't help her from a hospital bed. The police were trying, but it was clear they were outmatched by the scope and secrecy of the criminal network that had its eyes on her family. Morning light crept through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the notebook open in front of her, trying to piece together the puzzle her mother had left behind. It was all here. She knew that now. Everything that the gang was after. But the information was scattered, cryptic, written in a mix of shorthand and code that Sarah was struggling to decipher. Each entry felt like a glimpse into a world she didn't belong in, a world her mother had lived in for far too long. It was like looking at a stranger's life, yet that life had been intertwined with her own since the day she was born. The entries grew darker as the pages went on, filled with mentions of meetings, exchanges, and betrayal. Names she didn't recognize popped up alongside addresses and phone numbers that meant nothing to her. But one phrase kept appearing over and over again, in different forms: the money. The missing fortune that had set all of this in motion. It was always referenced in cryptic terms: the stash, the payout, the hidden cash, but never spelled out directly. It was as if her mother had been too afraid to put the full truth into words, even in a notebook that no one else was supposed to see. Sarah flipped to the last few pages, where the entries seemed rushed, the handwriting shakier. Her mother had been running out of time when she wrote these. That much was clear. One entry, dated just a few days before Sarah's birth, stood out. Final deal is done. Jack doesn't know. The money's safe. I can't risk it falling into their hands. I have to protect her. It's all for Sarah. They'll never find it, unless I tell them where to look. And I never will. Sarah stared at the page, her mind reeling. Her mother had hidden the money, the fortune the gang was after, and she had done it to protect Sarah. But where? Where had she hidden it? There was no clue, no address, no map, just the promise that they'll never find it. It wasn't much to go on, but it was the only lid Sarah had. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her concentration. Another message from the same unknown number. We're watching. Time's almost up. A cold chill ran down her spine. They were getting closer. She could feel it. The walls were closing in, and she was running out of options. But she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when she was so close to finding the truth. Sarah knew she had to leave. Staying in the house was too dangerous. If the gang was watching, they could strike at any moment, and she didn't want to be there when they did. She grabbed the notebook, shoving it into her backpack along with a few essentials, and headed out the door. As she got into her car, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, she realized there was only one place left to go: the old cabin. The cabin had been in her family for years, passed down from her grandparents, though no one had used it in a long time. It was isolated, tucked away deep in the woods about an hour outside of town. Her mother had taken her there once when she was younger, but they hadn't been back since. It was the kind of place where no one would think to look for her. And if her mother had hidden anything, it would have been in a place like that. A place no one else knew about, a place far from prying eyes. The drive to the cabin was tense. Sarah kept checking her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gang's car tailing her. But the roads were empty, and the farther she got from Green Hollow, the more the tension began to ease. By the time she turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, the knot of fear in her stomach had loosened just a little. The woods closed in around her as she drove, the trees tall and imposing, their branches forming a canopy overhead. It felt like entering another world, one where the danger and chaos of her life couldn't follow. The cabin appeared at the end of the road, just as she remembered it. A small weathered building with a sagging roof and peeling paint. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time, but to Sarah it felt like a lifeline. She parked the car and stepped out, the air cool and fresh around her. The silence was almost unnerving after everything she had been through. No sounds of cars, no voices, just the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. She approached the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. The key was still hidden under the loose stone by the front step, just as her mother had shown her years ago. Sarah unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the smell of dust and old wood. The cabin was exactly as she remembered it. Simple, bare, with a few pieces of furniture and a fireplace in the corner. It didn't look like a place where anyone had hidden a fortune, but Sarah knew better than to trust appearances. She set her backpack down on the small wooden table and pulled out the notebook. If the money was hidden here, there had to be a clue, something her mother had left behind. Sarah flipped through the pages again, scanning the entries for anything that might hint at the cabin's significance. Her eyes landed on a passage she had skimmed over before. The cabin is the only safe place now. I've done everything I can to make sure they won't find it. It's protected. She'll be safe there. Protected. Safe. Sarah's heart raced as the realization hit her. Her mother hadn't just hidden the money. She had hidden it here, at the cabin. But it wasn't just the money. Her mother had hidden something else, something far more valuable. And she had done it to keep Sarah safe. Sarah stood in the center of the small cabin, her mind racing. Where would her mother have hidden something so important? She scanned the room, her eyes falling on the old fireplace. It was the only part of the cabin that seemed out of place. The stones around it newer than the rest of the building, as if it had been rebuilt at some point. Sarah knelt down, running her hands over the stones, searching for any sign of a hidden compartment or a loose panel. And then she found it, a small, almost imperceptible crack in the mortar between two stones. Her fingers worked at the edges, prying the stone loose. It shifted slightly, and with a little more force, Sarah pulled it free. Behind the stone was a small cavity, just big enough to hold a metal box. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she pulled the box out, her hands trembling. She placed it on the floor in front of her, staring at it for a long moment before she opened the lid. Inside, neatly stacked, were bundles of cash. Thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. But that wasn't all. Beneath the money was a folder, thick with papers. Sarah pulled it out, her heart racing as she flipped through the documents. They were bank statements, property deeds, and legal documents, all in her mother's name. It seemed that Lisa had been far more than just a member of the gang. She had been playing a long game, moving money through shell companies and secret accounts, hiding it all from the gang while building a life for herself and Sarah. The money wasn't just stolen. It was laundered, hidden in plain sight through legitimate businesses that the gang had no way of tracing. And at the bottom of the folder, there was a letter addressed to Sarah. Her hands shaking, Sarah opened it. Sarah, if you're reading this, it means you found the truth. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything before, but I had to protect you. Everything I did for you. This money, it's our way out. I couldn't let them take it, not after everything they did to us. You need to take it and disappear. Leave Green Hollow. Leave everything behind. I know it's a lot to ask, but it's the only way to keep you safe. Please forgive me for all the secrets I kept. I love you more than anything. Mom. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she finished reading. The truth was finally out, but it didn't feel like a victory. Her mother had sacrificed everything to protect her, but now Sarah had to decide what to do with the life she had been handed. She closed the box, wiping away her tears, and stood up. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't run. Not anymore. The gang would never stop coming, not as long as they thought there was something left to take. The only way to end this was to confront them head-on, to show them that her mother had outsmarted them, and that Sarah wasn't afraid to finish what her mother had started.